Ireland punches way above its weight in the world of commercial aviation. Despite being a country of just 5 million people, it saw over 40 million pass through its airports in 2024, meaning it handled almost 8 airport passengers per Irish citizen or per capita. This is 70 to 80% higher than its closest competitors in Europe, and about 3x what the United States handles on a per capita basis. As such, the economic impact is huge. IATA estimates that aviation drives over $20 billion in economic activity every year, which is about 3.7% of GDP. 44,000 people are directly employed in aviation. This includes airlines, airports, airnav, manufacturing and maintenance, and then a further 34,500 are employed in aviation-driven tourism roles. Ireland is home to Europe's largest airline, Ryanair, and it's also home to the top 3 largest aircraft leasing companies in the world. In fact, over half of the world's 30,000 commercial aircraft are managed from Ireland, representing about $150 billion in assets. Amidst this backdrop of aviation industry heavyweights, you'd be forgiven for overlooking a company called Aer Lingus, the flag carrier of Ireland. But Aer Lingus is the country's original airline, the country's oldest airline, and in my view, an airline that should be celebrated. The green shamrock has long been a source of Irish pride and a key enabler of the brand Ireland. In this video, we're going to explore the fascinating history of Aer Lingus, from its modest beginnings as a critical air link between Ireland and the UK, all the way up until today, as a small but scrappy global carrier that plays an important strategic role in the IAG portfolio. As you'd expect, it hasn't been a linear journey. Aer Lingus has had many ups and downs along the way. Wars, recessions, pandemics, terrorism, and more recently, brutal competition that has driven it to change its business model multiple times, shifting from full service to low cost, and back to what they call a value hybrid model today. For much of their life, they were run by the Irish government, a blessing and a curse at times. And honestly, looking at some of the things that happened to them, it's nothing short of a miracle they never declared bankruptcy. Between 2006 and 2015, when they were acquired by IAG, they fought off not 1, not 2, but 3 takeover attempts by Ryanair, which spared them from being associated with Ryanair's budget brand, but also created more financial pressure and limited their ability to grow. Since the IAG takeover, Aer Lingus has had more access to capital and has grown its network accordingly, but it's still a fairly small airline, carrying about 11 million passengers per year on a fleet of under 60 planes. But I promise you, their influence is much more than their current operating scale would suggest. To truly understand the role Aer Lingus has played, we have to rewind the clock, all the way back to before Ireland even became independent from Britain. The late 1910s were a period of political instability and almost non-stop conflict. In 1918, the rebel party at the time, the Sinn Féin, won a majority of Irish seats in the British Parliament and declared a new Irish Republic. Britain wasn't yet ready to grant full independence to Ireland, so the Irish Republican Army launched a nearly 3-year guerrilla war, making conditions on the ground highly dangerous and unpredictable. Even though a treaty was signed in 1921, the conflict left Irish society divided and embittered for generations. In some instances, even members of the same family had opposing views, creating anxiety and fear of disapproval or even total abandonment. Today's world is far more peaceful, safe, and stable, but many of us, including myself, still find ourselves struggling with anxiety at times. That's why I'm grateful to have a resource like today's sponsor, BetterHelp, who has helped me confront anxiety head-on. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a perpetually anxious person, but I go on a lot of solo trips to faraway places, and those trips can create distance, both literally and figuratively, between me and the people I care about. Between my girlfriend, my brother, my parents, cousins, grandparents, and many others, it seems like there's always a big life event happening, whether that's a birthday, a big exam at school, an interview, even a surgery, and I want to be there to support them emotionally for every single one. If I'm not there for them, I kind of feel like I'm not doing enough. My therapist has been a tremendous source of encouragement, and I come out of every session with a clearer mind and with the confidence that I am doing enough to achieve my long-term goals. Especially in the spring, it feels like everyone around me has renewed energy and motivation, sort of ramping up the pressure to perform, if you will. I love this pressure, but at times it can get a bit overwhelming. If you feel the same way, I'd encourage you to give BetterHelp a try. To get started, all you need to do is fill out a short questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple days. If you don't jive with the first therapist you're matched with, that's totally okay. You can switch at any time and at no cost.
Now look, everyone's situation is different, and online therapy isn't going to be for everyone, but I think it's worth taking the first step. And the company has worked hard to establish a 4.3-star rating on Trustpilot with over 7,000 reviews. So if there's anyone to start your therapy journey with, it's them. For 10% off your first month of therapy, go to betterhelp.com/flaps10.
Now, back in Ireland, as many British loyalists were fleeing to avoid getting either ambushed or killed, there were two Brits in particular that were patently unafraid of entering Ireland. In fact, entering Ireland may have saved their lives. These two men were John Alcock and Arthur Brown, two brave British aviators. Their arrival into County Galway by air in June of 1919 marked the completion of the world's first non-stop transatlantic flight. The 16-hour and 28-minute journey wasn't without its struggles. Broken radios, fog, icing, snow, and severe turbulence, but it was totally worth it and earned the two fellas a cool 10,000 pounds, worth about 660,000 pounds today. 9 years later, in 1928, it was an Irishman, James Fitzmaurice, who finally made the same journey in the opposite direction, taking off from Baldonnel Aerodrome near Dublin and landing in Quebec some 36 hours later. This flight got the attention of the Irish public, with many realizing that commercial transatlantic air travel could actually soon be a reality, with Ireland being perfectly positioned to benefit from this development. Fitzmaurice, for his part, used his newfound fame to petition the Irish government to start a national airline, but the conditions just weren't right. The country was poor, and they wanted to prioritize defense spending. Several airline startups approached the government for subsidies, but they were denied. Ironically, it wasn't until the British started operating a flight between the two countries in 1933 that the Irish finally decided, for their own national dignity, they needed to operate a competing air route themselves. So, in 1936, Aer Lingus was born. Well, sort of. It actually took until 1937 for the government to actually pass legislation funding the airline, so in the meantime they got some help from a company called Blackpool and West Coast Air Services. Blackpool provided the initial £100,000 in capital they needed to start up operations, and in May of 1936, their first flight took off from Baldonnel, bound for Bristol in the UK. This flight, operated under the banner of Irish Sea Airways, was operated by a 6-seater de Havilland Dragon named Eolar, which is Irish for eagle. In its early days, Aer Lingus remained small. They only offered scheduled service to 3 destinations, as well as the occasional Dublin sightseeing tour. In 1940, they moved into the newly constructed Dublin Airport and took delivery of their first DC-3, but as war broke out in the skies above Europe, they quickly had to postpone their growth ambitions. Now remember, Ireland was technically neutral in World War II, but it offered covert support to the Allies and was known to repatriate any Allied pilots who either crash-landed there or washed up ashore. Luftwaffe crews, for their part, were instructed to destroy their aircraft if forced to land in Ireland to avoid them falling into British hands. At any rate, after the war, the British were eyeing Ireland as the proving ground for non-stop transatlantic passenger flights. The Irish, of course, weren't just going to let them come in without getting something in return. So in 1946, an agreement was struck. The British could use Shannon as a stopover point for their London to New York flights, but Aer Lingus would have exclusive rights to operate flights to the UK. Additionally, Aer Lingus would receive an investment from 2 British airlines, British Overseas Airways Corporation and British European Airways, to fuel their future growth. The fleet of all DC-3s was deployed to Paris, Amsterdam, and Brussels, with tickets costing £27 round trip in 1947, worth about £900 today. Now, you may be asking, Peter, why didn't Aer Lingus get into the transatlantic game themselves in the 1940s? Well, they originally planned to, but politics got in the way. Ireland's Taoiseach at the time, John A. Costello, was not a keen supporter of air travel and thought that flying the Atlantic was too grandiose a scheme for a small airline from a small country like Ireland. But that philosophy changed in the 50s. In 1951, a man named Sean Lemass, one of the original architects of Aer Lingus and one of its biggest proponents, regained power and influence as Minister for Industry and Commerce. Under his tenure, Aer Lingus ordered arguably the most modern plane of the time, the Vickers Viscount, and put them in service on flights to London, Manchester, and Paris. The Viscounts were bigger, faster, and quieter than the DC-3s. They had huge windows, they were pressurized, and they flew at higher altitudes, offering a much smoother ride. Guests were offered food free of charge, of course, but cigarettes were extra. Cargo services were also expanded during this period. Aer Lingus acquired a small fleet of Bristol 170s, which were used as sort of air ferries between Ireland and the UK. These were one of the only aircraft that could transport vehicles at the time, utilizing their distinct nose loading doors. In 1957, after another 3-year stint of the Costello government, Mr. Lemass was back in his seat, and he quickly got to work reinvigorating the Aer Lingus brand. The aging DC-3s were replaced with Fokker F-27 turboprops to better serve the continental European network. And then, plans for transatlantic flights were revived. Dublin to New York would be the first route, naturally, and the flight would be operated by a Lockheed Super Constellation on lease from Seaboard and Western Airlines. The first flight took off in 1958 and took over 14 hours with a technical stop in Gander. On board were 99 passengers in a single economy class cabin. Fares at the time originating in New York were $236 one way, worth around $2,600 today. For perspective, British Airways was charging $290 for New York to London in its economy class equivalent, called tourist class, but you could, of course, upgrade to their deluxe class for almost double the cost. At any rate, Aer Lingus' new route proved popular in its first year, carrying over 15,000 passengers. It's worth pointing out that they had a monopoly on the Dublin to New York route, as US carriers were not allowed to land in Dublin, only Shannon. This whole Dublin landing rights issue is a topic for another video, but all you need to know for now is that while it enhanced Aer Lingus' competitive position, it sort of limited Dublin's growth as a tourist destination. Major hotel chains like Hilton even refused to build new hotels there until restrictions were lifted in 1973. Now, in the 1950s, Ireland was experiencing its most significant mass emigration event since the potato famine. It's estimated that 500,000 people left the country during the decade, which you'd think would spell trouble for its national air carrier, but Aer Lingus wasn't doing too bad. There were an estimated 20 million Irish Americans with strong ties to Ireland, and that proved tremendously useful for the airline. By targeting this population, they were able to attract around 62,000 visitors from the United States in 1960 and bring in £3 million of profit. Despite being a government-run airline, they had developed a reputation for safety, comfort, and reliability. Before we proceed into the jet age, I just want to take a moment to thank you guys for watching. Just reading the comments on the past couple of videos has been really inspiring. You guys have some pretty awesome stories and experiences. So one of my goals for this year is to connect with more of you personally. If you are interested in connecting, all you need to do is submit your info on my website, and I'll try my best to reach out, especially if I'm visiting your city or country. And of course, as a token of my appreciation, everyone who fills out the form will be entered to win a $50 airline gift card of their choice, and I'll be picking 2 winners at the end of March. Thanks again for your support, and let's get back to the video. Witnessing the success of Boeing's Comets and Pan Am's 707s, they soon acquired jets of their own, starting with the Boeing 720. The 720 was essentially a shortened version of the Boeing 707 and one of the fastest subsonic planes ever built, with a maximum cruise speed of 611 miles per hour. The so-called Shamrock jet could leave Shannon at 5:15 p.m. and arrive in New York before 7, a journey time of just 6 hours and 15 minutes. That cut journey times in less than half from the Super Connie days. Soon their European network saw upgrades to jets as well. In 1965, Aer Lingus started taking delivery of BAC 111s, affectionately known as pocket rockets. The time savings weren't as large on these European routes, which were already being served by Viscounts. But a jet was a jet, they cruised higher, they were quieter, and just generally more pleasant from a passenger standpoint. In 1966, Chicago and Montreal were added to the Transatlantic schedule, bringing the total number of North American destinations to 4. Now, in addition to adding new planes and routes, Aer Lingus also started to dip its toes into other verticals, investing in Irish intercontinental hotels and even opening a hotel of their own in the 1970s. Their business model was evolving, and in the mid-60s, they decided to reorganize, mostly to allow the British to sell their 40% stake, but also to separate Aer Lingus from Air Rianta, its legacy holding company whose main focus had become managing airports. If you've ever shopped duty-free in an airport, you can thank Air Rianta. They were the original inventors of the concept in 1947 at Shannon Airport. Anyways, Aer Lingus and its transatlantic subsidiary, Aer Lingus Éireann, would now be managed directly by the Irish Minister of Finance, which in theory would allow it to be a little bit more nimble, doubling down on things that were working and cutting back on things that weren't. And one thing that most certainly was working was the Transatlantic service. So in the late 60s, Aer Lingus decided to go big, ordering not only the 747 jumbo jet, but also the Boeing 2707, a supersonic airplane that would have connected Dublin with New York in 2 hours and 30 minutes. Now, although their supersonic dream wouldn't materialize, they did end up taking delivery of two 747-100s in 1971, which was, in my opinion, the most tangible manifestation of Aer Lingus' success over the past decade. The 60s were the golden age for Aer Lingus. The economy grew nicely both at home and abroad, and Anglo-Irish relations had stabilized, meaning the country was now perceived as safer than in prior decades. Aer Lingus was one of the first global airlines to implement a computerized reservation system in late 1968, ahead of TWA, United, KLM, Swissair, and Alitalia. I mean, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. The carrier did suffer its first major accident in 1968, but Aer Lingus entered the 70s a much stronger, more sophisticated airline with global brand recognition. And that made them more of a target for regulatory authorities in the US, who threatened to suspend their landing rights at New York's JFK Airport unless Dublin would allow US airlines to land there. Ultimately, Irish authorities coalesced, but it didn't really matter. Dublin ended up being a total flop for US carriers. Pan Am declined to fly there, and TWA only operated the route until 1979. Why? Well, first you had Bloody Sunday in 1972, which was followed by the burning of the British Embassy in Dublin. In 1974, there were a series of car bombings in Dublin, killing 33 and injuring almost 300. In 1975, a bomb exploded in the arrivals terminal at Dublin Airport, killing an Aer Lingus employee. This string of events was not good for tourism. To make matters worse, you had a global energy crisis in 73 and 74, which led to higher gas prices and just more cost-conscious consumers overall. This obviously impacted demand. Those new 747s were proving difficult to fill, and Aer Lingus posted financial losses throughout the first part of the decade. However, their identity as a more affordable airline mitigated some of the stress. Come 1974, the company claimed it kept as much as 13% more of its seats occupied than any other line flying the North Atlantic. In addition, its decision to diversify its business, specifically acquiring a big London hotel and two of Ireland's biggest tour promotion agencies, helped it break even in 1974 despite all the issues I mentioned. But Aer Lingus' two most profitable investments were yet to come. Those were Guinness Peak Aviation, an aircraft leasing company, and the US-based Dunphy Hotel Group. The returns on this hotel investment were insane. Aer Lingus invested £370,000 in 1976 and sold its stake in 1988 for £188 million. I mean, what? Guinness Peak became the world's largest commercial aircraft lessor, worth $4 billion, and it generated around £7 to £8 million per year for Aer Lingus from the late 70s to the early 90s. Now, all this to say, the 70s was an uphill battle. Aer Lingus as an airline was treading water, but Aer Lingus as a company grew materially, mostly thanks to entrepreneurial thinking by public employees of the Irish state. Now, that's not to say the airline didn't make strides during the 70s. They introduced a new logo, new uniforms, and a loyalty program. They famously carried the Pope Transatlantic on one of their 747s in 1979, which was sort of their chance to demonstrate Irish hospitality to the world. But they also battled labor disputes, rising fuel costs, and bitter Anglo-Irish politics that forced the airline to close a number of their European routes through Manchester. As a result, the airline part of Aer Lingus only made money for 1 or 2 years during the 70s and entered the 80s in sort of a nosedive trajectory, especially the transatlantic business, which had gotten absolutely decimated by flying gas-guzzling 747s and half-full 707s to Chicago and Montreal. Now, as many of you may know, the 80s marked a period of airline deregulation and heightened competition. Perhaps the most consequential event of the decade was the founding of a small regional airline called Ryanair in 1984. The man behind it, Tony Ryan, had grown up working for Aer Lingus and later co-founded Guinness Peak Aviation, so he had accumulated a bit of wealth and wanted to use it to go head-to-head with Aer Lingus. He believed fares in Europe had gotten too high, and I can't say he was wrong. I mean, at the time it cost £200 to £300 to travel between Dublin and London, when the average industrial wage was £15,000 to £20,000 per year. Now, Ryanair didn't explicitly set out to become a budget carrier. They just wanted to offer cheaper fares than the legacy carriers while still offering a safe and reliable air service. Their introductory fares were £99 return between Waterford and London, which was cheap enough to attract 82,000 passengers in its first year. But throughout the 80s, it lost a ton of money. So much so that Michael O'Leary begged Tony Ryan to shut it down, calling the airline a bottomless pit for his cash. All this to say that Ryanair didn't really have a viable business model in the 80s, but they put sufficient downward pressure on fares to erode Aer Lingus' profitability. Aer Lingus responded by lowering fares and cutting costs, while also expanding its new commuter subsidiary, Aer Lingus Commuter. These efforts were quite successful, enabling the airline to grow traffic almost 30% in a single year between Ireland and the UK. You see, Ryanair's low fares had convinced more people to fly, people that would have otherwise taken the road, rail, and ferry to the UK. Soon, Aer Lingus started snapping up some of these passengers with low fares of their own. Simultaneously, they started taking delivery of new short-haul planes in one of the most ambitious fleet renewal programs in its history, which of course differentiated it from Ryanair and British Airways. But the timing was awful, as they accumulated over £500 million in debt right before the Gulf War hit, and right before Ryanair finally figured things out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1989, Seamus Brennan, the new Irish Minister for Transport, became convinced that increasing competition in the airline business was in the national interest. Ryanair was permitted to greatly expand its operations, competing head-to-head with Aer Lingus on more routes to the UK. In addition, Ryanair went full low-cost mode, eliminating business class, eliminating free food and drink, scrapping its frequent flyer program, and adopting a single aircraft type, the BAC 111. So when crisis hit in the early 90s, specifically less demand and higher fuel costs, Ryanair was better equipped to handle it than Aer Lingus. In 1992, the Aer Lingus group as a whole lost money for the first time in over a decade, and with all the interest payments on the £500 million plus in debt, they found themselves in a serious cash crunch. Guinness Peak Aviation, once valued at £4 billion, had collapsed spectacularly, meaning Aer Lingus would no longer be receiving any profits from that investment. Atlantic routes were getting pummeled because it was now cheaper for flyers to connect in London and backtrack to Ireland. As such, the situation continued to deteriorate into 1993, with the airline losing over £100 million, and something had to change. Fast. So in 1994, the government swooped in with an £175 million cash injection and a proposal to radically reduce costs. All non-core assets were either sold or dissolved, the largest of which was Copthorne Hotels, netting the carrier £234 million. All this cash was used to pay down debt, reducing annual interest payments, and then 1,200 jobs were eliminated, which reduced annual payroll costs. These cuts, along with a massive bounce back in demand in 1995, saw Aer Lingus return to profitability, and honestly, the rest of the decade was sort of a movie for them. They jettisoned their gas-guzzling 747s, replacing them with the much more efficient A330s. And in fact, they were the very first airline to fly the ETOPS A330 in 1994. And in 1996, they launched a new brand.
Today reflects a new beginning for Aer Lingus. They have been very successful in the past. We would like to build on that success, and I'm looking forward in the next number of weeks to receiving the preliminary reports of Aer Lingus, which will show it in a very healthy trading position.
Service to LA was launched in 1999, and soon after, Aer Lingus was confirmed as the 9th member of the One World Alliance, locking in key partnerships with British Airways and American Airlines to expand the number of destinations it could offer its customers. Things were looking up. As the carrier returned to health, the government contemplated privatization. On its current growth trajectory, management predicted Aer Lingus would need somewhere in the neighborhood of £400 to £500 million to invest in aircraft over the coming 5 years, which could easily be achieved through a successful IPO. However, as you all know, a successful IPO is highly dependent on market conditions, and right before the carrier was set to go public, the dot-com bubble burst in the US, and then 9/11 hit. But either way, the plan was going to face staunch opposition from the unions, who argued they were already getting underpaid and that Aer Lingus in private hands would make it even more difficult for them to obtain the wage increases they had been pushing for. So as a result, the IPO didn't take place and no money was raised, which wasn't good, because come October of 2001, Transatlantic bookings had collapsed and the airline was losing about £2 million a day, and estimated it had no more than 6 months before it ran out of cash. It was clear at this point the problem wasn't going to be solved by politicians at the Dole Airline or even by career business people. Turns out all the airline needed was one of its former pilots to turn things around. Willie Walsh, who started his career with Aer Lingus as a cadet at age 17 in 1979, worked his way up the ladder to become CEO of arguably Europe's most troubled airline in October of 2001. He outlined a plan to eliminate 2,500 jobs and transition the airline to a low-cost carrier, much like Ryanair. Gone was the free food and drink. Gone was the shamrock on Aer Lingus' tails. In its place is a big fat advertisement for the Aer Lingus website where guests would go to get fares that were up to 37.5% cheaper on short-haul routes and 25% cheaper on long-haul routes. It was radical, but it worked, at least in the short term. Aer Lingus went from losing 140 million euros in 2001 to making 83 million in 2003. With momentum carrying into late 2004, Mr. Walsh strongly believed the time was ripe for privatization. And the government wasn't necessarily opposed, but a new transport minister had just been named, and an election cycle was coming up, so the plan was shelved indefinitely. This frustrated Mr. Walsh because he felt the IPO needed to happen immediately, when Aer Lingus still had momentum. Who was to know where they'd be a year and a half later? So when the government wouldn't take action, he ultimately resigned, along with his CFO and COO. He was succeeded by former Emirates executive Dermot Mannion, who was a little more patient, and Aer Lingus did ultimately go public in September of 2006. Now the IPO was a blessing and a curse. It raised the airline £500 million in much-needed capital to fund its future growth plans while freeing it from government control, but someone else wanted control of the airline, and with shares now being publicly traded, nothing could stop them from building a minority stake. That company was Ryanair, and within the first week of trading, they had purchased over 15% of the airline's shares. Soon thereafter, they announced a full takeover bid valuing Aer Lingus at 1.5 billion euros. The deal was opposed by the government, Aer Lingus employees, as well as billionaire businessman Dennis O'Brien, and ultimately was rejected, but it wasn't the last time Ryanair would come knocking. 3 years later, when the airline was reeling from the effects of the global financial crisis, Ryanair again launched a bid, which I'd call highly opportunistic, at around half the valuation it had offered in 2006, but still at a 27% premium to where the airline's shares were currently trading. Now, mind you, between 2006 and 2009, Aer Lingus had changed, both for better and for worse. The short-haul operation got a boost from new operating bases at Belfast and Gatwick, while the long-haul operation was aided by the EU-US Open Skies Agreement in 2007, which eliminated the requirement of stopping in Shannon for half of all transatlantic flights. However, due to its decision to go full low-cost mode, Aer Lingus withdrew from the One World Alliance in favor of bilateral agreements with several airlines, including JetBlue, United, and others. At any rate, Ryanair bid number 2 was rejected, and Aer Lingus got a new CEO, who injected new life into the carrier. Christoph Muller did a thorough assessment of the business model and concluded that Aer Lingus had swung too far towards the low-cost side of the house, especially on long-haul routes, and needed to enhance its product to better compete with the likes of Delta, American, and others. This investment, along with selective cost cuts, pricing optimization, and strict capacity controls, allowed the airline to recover swiftly from the recession, generating a profit from 2010 all the way up until 2015 when they were acquired by IAG. When IAG first launched their takeover attempt, they valued the airline at 1 billion euros, which ironically was lower than Ryanair's offer back in 2006. Aer Lingus shareholders rejected the initial offer, but IAG upped the ante, revising its offer to €2.40 and eventually €2.50 per share, representing a valuation of 1.36 billion euros. IAG needed the approval of shareholders, including the Irish government and Ryanair, as well as EU regulators. The government was a fairly easy sell, but it was a little tougher to convince Michael O'Leary to give up his decade-long dream of creating an Irish mega airline. However, he ultimately coalesced, claiming Ryanair no longer wanted or needed Aer Lingus because it was so strong across Europe by itself. So all that was left was the EU Commission, and they ultimately gave IAG the green light contingent on IAG giving up 5 slots at London Gatwick Airport. So that was that. Aer Lingus became a wholly owned subsidiary of IAG, ending almost 80 years of Irish government involvement in the airline, and also putting the incessant Ryanair headache to bed. In my view, it was only a matter of time before someone took them over. I'm not saying they couldn't have survived on their own. In fact, I think they certainly could have, but the relatively small size was always going to make them vulnerable during industry downturns. Now, they not only have a safety net in the form of IAG's balance sheet,
but they also have access to thousands, if not millions, more potential customers through IAG's sales channels. Most importantly, the Shamrock lives on, both as a paint job and as a call sign, preserving almost 90 years of Irish history, tradition, and innovation in the world of aviation. Their survival through some of the most brutal industry events the world has ever seen, with some government help, yes, but also with a lot of innovative thinking and strategic execution, has inspired me, and I hope it inspired you too. But as always, thanks for coming along with me today, and I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long.